Thank you, Peter, and fellow Rotarians. It's my pleasure to introduce to the club His Excellency Peter Woolcott, Ambassador for Australia. After practising as a barrister in Sydney for a number of years, His Excellency joined the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs, serving in Jamaica, Argentina, the Philippines as Deputy Head of Mission, and Consul General in Honolulu. He was also representative to the United Nations Pacific Command from 1998 to 2001. He was Deputy Head of Mission in Jakarta, Chief of Staff to the Minister for Foreign Affairs, 2002 to 2004, and the Australian Ambassador to Italy from 2004 to 2007. Between 2007 and 2009, he was First Assistant Secretary of the Southeast Asia Division of the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and was appointed as the People Smuggling Envoy in the year 2009. Following this, he took up a position as Australia's Ambassador to the United Nations based in Geneva in 2010. In April 2013, under his presidency, the Arms Trade Treaty was adopted by the UN General Assembly, and in 2015 he spearheaded Australia's negotiating terms at climate talks in the United Nations. In 2017, His Excellency was appointed an Officer of the Order of Australia for distinguished service to public administration in the field of international relations and as a lead negotiator in the non-proliferation and arms control fields. Peter is married with 3 university-aged children. He has a Kiwi connection in that his wife is the daughter of Fred Hollows, the famous eye surgeon. Fellows, would you please join me in welcoming Peter Woolcott.
Look, thank you very much for the very kind invitation. Thank you, Peter, for that, and thank you, Lady Susan Sachinan, for being part of that invitation as well. Thank you, John, for your very, very kind words. And it's a hard act to follow, Olivia's, I have to say. And I may be longer than 5 minutes, but really very impressive what you've just done. Can I say that Yusuf has very kindly set the scene, I think, about Australia. So those 10 questions in terms of feral camels, dingo fences, Australian female convicts mooning their governor, beer swilling, world record holding Australian prime ministers, eating our national emblem. So you can all sit back and say, well, we made the right choice in 1901, didn't we? And not join that lot. But seriously, I've been here for over a year now, and it's been a fascinating job. One of the first things I did was meet with, when I came here, because I'd worked with Kiwis a lot, but I never actually worked on New Zealand issues. So one of the first things I did was to meet with senior people in the advertising industry who'd worked on both sides of the Tasman to explore the differences between us. Because while our values and the way we live are similar, we're not the same. And there are differences which come through in our worldview as well. One is a factor, I think, of geographic location. New Zealand still has a sense of apartness and distance from the rest of the world. And that's of course reflected, I think, in your civic cultures. Australia very much sees itself as part of Asia. It's been bombed, it's been had major people smuggling issues. It's right there as part of Asia, and we see Asia as our world. With you, there's that sense of distance and apartness again. So that you're a bit removed from some of the world's problems. And that, as I said, that flows through into our respective civic cultures. And so your focus tends to be more on social policy and less on national security matters than Australia's is. A second aspect of that difference is around the environment. Again, I think that flows into our sort of civic makeup. New Zealanders have a strong personal connection to nature. sense that they live in the loveliest and most exquisite part of the earth, and you're very passionate about causes which are essentially environmental, whaling, anti-nuclear, and the oceans. Australia, the relationship with the land is reflected in a different way. It's something of an uneasy alliance. Everything out there will kill you, essentially. It's harsh, it's expansive, it's dangerous, and it's captivating. And again, that flows through to our different civic cultures. Another important difference which I sense too, came through in these discussions in my time here, is around biculturalism and multiculturalism. New Zealand is a very successful bicultural nation. But you're now moving to a multicultural society, and that's in fact going to challenge New Zealanders and their sense of identity, and particularly Maori's sense of identity. You just look at Auckland, and it's conducted its own pivot to Asia. Now, Australia is a very successful multicultural nation, but it still has major issues around the well-being of our Indigenous people. And if you look at the latest census of Australia, which just came out last week, in fact, more than a quarter of Australian residents were born overseas. And for the first time, more people born overseas were born in Asia than in Europe. And that's, again, very much part of the modern Australia. Now, there's no doubt that New Zealand is our most comprehensive relationship. I mean, it's a really heavy relationship. There's ballast everywhere in it. And expectations around it are great. The latest Lowy poll produced in Australia, again just a couple of weeks ago, showed that 85% of Australians had genuine warmth towards New Zealand, which is way higher than any other nation. But the bottom line is, we are two sovereign countries with distinct political systems, and those political systems need to be responsive to different electoral forces. And the way I tend to talk about the relationship quite a lot is there's an element of competition and an element of cooperation. And at one end of the spectrum you have rugby, and that's a 100% competition. And the other end of the spectrum is something like counter-terrorism, where you have 100% cooperation. And it's a matter of getting the balance right in the other areas, whether you're talking about agriculture or an agri-tech, or whether you're talking about Antarctica. There are some elements of competition, but there's also a lot of areas there we need to be cooperating on as well. And so on every other aspect of the relationship, it's about getting that balance right. I think at the core of the Australia-New Zealand relationship are the economic and people-to-people links. Now, we go back to the comprehensive economic relationship and freedom of movement, and that's been fundamental to the way we've been able to grow together. And I also think the relationship is an increasingly mature one, and that's reflected, I think, in an increasingly confident New Zealand. We're family, but the idea of the little cousin, I think, is less and less prevalent. There is this, as I say, this confidence about New Zealand and where you're moving, which is a very good thing and a very positive thing for the relationship as well. Now, there are always going to be niggling aspects in a relationship this profound and this deep. But what I see is a very practical management of these issues by governments on both sides of the Tasman. When there's a problem, they know each other, they talk, they text. At every level there's this interconnection. And that's an important part of managing these sorts of issues. Because ultimately we are both highly dependent for our prosperity on trade, on a continuing shared respect for liberal democratic values, as well as for international norms, and many of these things are under challenge. Let me talk about sort of the three buckets of issues. I better keep an eye on the time here, I know. One is on the economic and trade side. The architecture is in excellent place. Leaders meet annually, Prime Ministers, Defence Ministers, Treasurers. The Australian-New Zealand Leadership Forum basically handles the business side of the relationship. And so there's plenty of meetings, plenty of opportunities to discuss and sort through problems. If you look at the depth of the economic relationship, some basic statistics, we are your largest trading partner if you include services, some $25 billion. And it's been growing at over 10% since 2012, and over 75% of New Zealand's exporting businesses derive income from Australia. Now, also, Australian investment here is over $100 billion, and we're the largest investor in New Zealand, accounting for over half of foreign direct investment in New Zealand. And New Zealand investment in Australia also last year totaled over $12 billion, or something like 53.4% of your foreign direct investment. New Zealand economy is a good story. I don't need to tell you that. 7th year of expansion and budget return to surplus. But despite what you read, the Australian in the Australian and New Zealand media, it's not too shabby across the Tasman either. The Australian economy has now recorded 26 years of growth and without a recession. Just as New Zealand weathered the dairy doldrums on the back of strong construction and growth in service industries, Australia's done the same in the mining boom. Our economy is now more diversified and resilient, and global commodity prices are starting to rebound as well. And so the OECD predicts our GDP growth will be back above 3% next year. We remain the world's 13th largest economy, and our GDP per capita is well above the OECD average and 34% above New Zealand. Our productivity growth is an area where we need to improve, and the government's National Innovation and Science Agenda will help in that regard. And we're looking to see what we can do with New Zealand in this matter too. The two PMs signed a Science and Innovation Treaty in Queenstown this year, and we're looking to very much build on that in terms of where we can develop centres of excellence together. So our PMs are keen to look under the hood of the single economic market and work in a range of areas around infrastructure, science innovation, agribusiness, health and more seamless borders to ensure that our economies continue to work very smoothly and in step with each other. Let me turn quickly to foreign policy and national security. We have a basic commonality of interests, and we both benefit where we work together on issues. That's particularly true at the moment in the Pacific, where we have different focus and different strengths, but it's a critical area of cooperation, and it's in fact very strong at the moment as we both look to try to work out how we're going to address issues going forward in the Pacific, where our influence is waning. And there are a lot more competing actors, and it's becoming a lot more tricky for us to manage. It's where we do need to work very closely together. We also need to work very closely together on managing Beijing's natural interests in seeking strategic power to match its economic power. And that's again changing the very dynamics of how the Pacific works. Also in the multilateral arena, the rule of law and more generally the system itself is under challenge from emerging powers. It's been a pretty comfortable world for us since 1945. That's all under challenge. And again, we'll need to work very closely together. And then also on the issue of counter-terrorism, which we tend to think about as almost a Middle Eastern issue. But in fact, if you look what's happening with returning fighters, and look what's happening in the Philippines at the moment, and the threat in our region, in Southeast Asia, around counter-terrorism, that's becoming very much a big issue for us to manage. Now, as noted earlier, there are differences in our worldview. New Zealand public does take a bit of comfort from the fact that Australia, a continent the size of Europe, sits across the top of New Zealand. And Australia can always be relied upon to take a hard-headed approach to these issues. It's understandable, but in my view, we both need to play active roles in protecting and shaping the future of an increasingly complex, uncertain regional environment. There is between us a growing strategic like-mindedness, and we are comfortable doing things together cooperatively. If you look at East Timor, at Ramsey in the Solomon Islands, and now in Taji in Iraq, where we work very closely together, this is indicative of this increasing preparedness to do things in a very like-minded manner. The reality is that we are New Zealand's only ally, and we look to be able to work together as trusted partners with you. Interoperability is the key, doctrine, training, strategic engagement, and your white paper which you produced this year was, we thought, a very good piece of work. It's worth remembering that for every dollar New Zealand spends on defence, we spend $16. Not a bad statistic, that. And similarly, the billions or so we spend annually on border protection and stopping the flow of illegal migrants coming by boat to Australia has also meant that no single boat has sailed into New Zealand harbour. As your only defence ally, we do have expectations that you will be able to play a role alongside us in meeting our common security interests. And we also work very closely in the intelligence space as Five Eyes partners. I've mentioned counter-terrorism, but also cyber is another area where increasingly we have to be very alert to what's happening in the world, both in terms of protecting business interests and our commercial interests, but in protecting governments. Finally, let me turn to the people-to-people links. About 650,000 Kiwis live in Australia, some 12% of your population, and about 65,000 Australians live here. And about 2.6 million tourists cross the Tasman each year. It's about 1.3 in each direction. So there's a huge merging of peoples and ideas and thoughts between us. And this is where there's been some tension recently. There's been some fraying. One is over the handling of deportations. Now again, where the information flows around deportations are working much better. The appeal process around the deportations have also shown consistent and robust success rates. And that area is again being managed I think in a less controversial way. It's still happening. Numbers are much reduced, but it's being handled in a much less contentious way. There's also the issue of pathways to citizenship. That opened on the 1st of July, and that means that any New Zealand, before 2001 we had separate rules. We'd really treat each other's citizens very much as each other's. Since then, we've gone on a different course, and that's led to some issues. Now, what we've done with the pathways to citizenship aspect is if you're a resident for 5 years prior to application, and that's up until 19th of February 2016, since 2001, and you had a taxable income threshold of $53,900, then you could automatically apply to become a permanent resident, and after 1 year as a permanent resident, become a citizen of Australia. And there are also special arrangements for vulnerable groups. So it should be recognised that no other nationality can simply jump on a plane to Australia, get a job, bring out all their relatives, start a company, or take out a tertiary studies loan or have access to this pathway. It's quite a unique provision for New Zealanders as a recognition of that special relationship. And it's worth understanding that many other large and successful migrant groups question why they can't so easily bring to Australia their grandfather or uncle. But it's something that has been set in place between the two governments, and it's something which I think is a template for the future. There are also recent New Zealand concerns about treatment and access to services of Kiwis in Australia, and there was a recent storm over education. Again, it needs to be understood that this is not in any way directed, it's budget driven. Essentially. And it is the outcome of a conscious decisions made in 2001 by Helen Clark and John Howard to actually do things in a slightly different way. We also have enormously strong political and bureaucratic linkages. The New Zealand government is seen in Australia as nimble. We actually it can do things because of its size, because there's no Senate, because there are no states, that we find very interesting. It's almost like we see each other as two Petri dishes and we study each other, and your Petri dish is probably actually a lot more interesting than ours at the moment because of the nimbleness of some of the ideas going on here around good governance. And that's particularly true in the social investment sphere, where we're doing a lot of work in looking at what New Zealand is doing there. And finally, can I say we have each other's back. When it comes to natural disasters, there's no hesitation, whether it be the response to the Christchurch and Kaikoura earthquakes, or the Ash Wednesday fires in Australia, about the response from each other's civil defence and military units. So I think that's the sort of final point to make on that we do have each other's back around those sorts of things. So let me conclude, because I know I haven't got much time and I'm very happy to take questions. Australia figures constantly in the New Zealand psyche because of our size, geographic location. We all look north these days. Our economic weight, New Zealand diaspora, as sporting rivals, and as New Zealand's ultimate security guarantor. Informed as New Zealanders know Australia well. And New Zealand is important to Australia for many of the same reasons. Its government is seen as effective and nimble, including its foreign and trade policy, the long-standing defence and intelligence relationship as well. It is also a highly valued marketplace. Its people smart and practical, and its sporting team's often too damn good, I have to say that. But the reality is, and this should come as no surprise to anyone here, that Australia's consciousness of New Zealand is of a low order, because we do spend our time looking north, not south, as do you. And so frustration can easily creep into any relationship when things are taken too much for granted. And of course, this works both ways. So the challenge on both sides of the Tasman, and this is part of my challenge as well, is to avoid any hint of complacency. We need to keep honing our strengths and linkages while ensuring that the points of differences do not obscure how well we line up across most activities and issues. So it is a special relationship, but like all relationships, they require a constant attention and work. So thank you, and very happy to take questions.
Time's tight, but it will be a shame not to offer questions when we've got His Excellency here, so we'll take a couple. John.
I think there was an excellent talk. I recall going to a government meeting in Darwin with the North Territory government, and the map was Darwin and Asia. It didn't include the rest of Australia. So looking north, what attitude do you take into North Korea? There's been very little said in Australia that we've heard in objecting to North Korea.
We've taken a very strong attitude to North Korea, including bringing in autonomous sanctions, so not just the UN sanctions around North Korea, but also autonomous sanctions ourselves, which go further than the UN sanctions. We've also, in the G20 meeting at the moment, there's been the opportunity for our Prime Minister to take this up with the Chinese President Xi of China. And the reality is we think China needs to do more. Any military solution around North Korea, I think, frankly, is very hard to envisage. It would be the consequences for Japan and South Korea from any military intervention around their nuclear facilities, their nuclear weapons, is fraught. So, who has the influence and the leverage on North Korea? Who can actually influence that government? And really, we can only do so much around sanctions. And the UN system can only do so much around sanctions. It comes down really to the Chinese, who still hold a lot of the economic cards with the North Koreans, and getting them to increase their pressure. Their rhetoric is okay around this, but if you actually look at what's happening, I think there's a lot more they can do in trying to bring to heel someone who is a major disruptive force and a dangerous force in our world. But it's a difficult situation, there's no doubt about that.
One more? No? I'll put on. Thank you, Speaker.
Thank you very much.